Hello, friends. This is Libby. Welcome to my YouTube channel. I hope you're all doing really well today. It is March 1st as I record this, so this is super exciting. It is finally getting there. We're getting to spring. We've had the craziest week with weather where I live. It was one day 70 degrees Fahrenheit. I was out on my patio in my shorts, and the very next day it was snowing. It was snowing, blowing, terrible, terrible snow, wind, everything, and felt a little bit miserable, but it's okay today. It's kind of been in between, and we're getting there. We're getting there. So I want you to grab something to drink, get cozy, get comfortable, so we can have a chat. Talks books here. If you've never been, this is just a book chat, really. And I like to talk about what I'm reading, what you're reading. If you want to jump in the comments and put in 2 cents about something I've read or what you maybe are into right now too, that's great. So I want to start out talking about Father by Elizabeth von Arnim. This is book that I was talking about in my last video. And I started this book last week, and I finished it in about 3 days. So it's a book that takes place in the 1930s. And she is, her name's Jennifer. She's 33, and she's single, and she lives with her dad. And they're in England. Her mom has died, and she made her promise to take care of her father, hence the name Father for the book, because he's really domineering, he's a writer, and she does take care of him by working for him, essentially, without pay, of course, where she basically writes down all of his book things, his notes, she edits, and does all of that for him. What I like about this book is it gets into the minds of all the characters. So you're not only knowing how she feels about things, but you're knowing how her father feels about things, how her, the people she meets feel about things. And so her dad really is pretty much a narcissist. He's very, very critical. Only he can do right, and she's just meh, And so she does all this stuff for him, and he doesn't appreciate it. And it starts out by him coming home with a new bride, and his bride is younger even than Jennifer is. So she doesn't have a problem with that. She's thrilled because she thinks, I don't have to take care of this guy anymore. His wife can. So they go off on their honeymoon, and she has a little bit of money that she gets from her mom, left her 100 pounds a year, I believe it is. And so she goes to find herself a place where she can rent and live and have a life finally for herself. So she does that, and it's a very humorous book. There's a lot of serious things in there. I mean, it's really sad for her because she doesn't have anybody who looks out for her. And I like how much she looks out for herself in this book, how she really sees that she deserves this new life. And she doesn't question that too much. She does feel a little bit of guilt, but she also knows that her dad doesn't care about her. He's never shown her affection. He just isn't interested in her at all, except for what she can do for him. So yeah, basic narcissist there. And so she goes to a couple of different villages. She wants to live in the country. Nature's really important to her, and she's always lived in London. And the house there is dark. It's always just explained as dark, no nature. She goes for a walk every day, but it's just down these dusty streets, So she goes to the first village. It doesn't work out. It's funny how it doesn't work out, but I won't get into it in case you want to read it, because I don't want to ruin the humor of the irony and everything in there. But then she goes to the second village, and there, that's where she starts her new life. I don't want to get too much into what happens, but there is a romance that starts to take place. And it's so funny because it's in his head, it's in her head. They're thinking totally different things. She's not in a place, you know, she's just there to start a life of her own. She doesn't really want a boyfriend. That's not her point. So it's just really funny. And then he's got a sister and she's just dreadful. A lot of characters in there are very morally gray, to say the least. They're very annoying kinds of people. But a lot of things happen in this. And it's really amusing and light, but at the same time has a great message, because you have to follow your heart. You have to follow your intuition. You have to sometimes set those boundaries and tell people no. And this was written at such a time when women didn't really do that. They were starting to, I think. But there's a lot in this that's talks kind of about sex and that sort of thing, which was surprising to me. But I liked it. The book, I mean, there aren't sex scenes, don't get me wrong, but it's mentioned in there. It's a theme. And it's a funny book because so many different things happen. Of course, her plans are thwarted every time she tries to do something. And it's ultimately about having a will of your own and doing what's right for you, regardless if you think that's right for somebody else or not. You have to put yourself first before you can do anything else. So I highly recommend this book. It is good. I want to read Enchanted April. I think that's the one she's most known for, and that's the one there's a movie of, The Enchanted April, which takes place in Italy. So I think it would be fun to read and a great spring read as well. So I'm going to give that one a shot. The next thing I want to do is talk about Wuthering Heights. So I'm going to start I don't know if I'm going to do more than one video on Wuthering Heights or just make it kind of a little bit longer video. But if you've never read it, this is my beat up copy from when I was 16. I got this thing, and I like it because it's got Heathcliff looking very debonair there. He looks very much like a hero, although he very much is not a hero. And then Kathy there looking so demure, even though she is very much not. But I've had this book forever. It's kind of fallen apart. And I got this, I'm pretty sure I got this at Walden Books in the mall near my house. We used to have 2 bookstores in our mall back, I guess, when people read books. And they got rid of those both. I think by the time I was a senior in high school, we only had one of the stores. We kept Walden for a long time. And then it went by the wayside too, which was so sad because I used to make trips to the mall just to go to the bookstore. And we really have never really had, well, I can't say that. We have had some smaller bookstores and they just go out. And it's a pretty big city here. We've got, 200-some thousand people. But we have we have 2 used bookstores and no new bookstores except for Barnes & Noble. And we had 2 nice large Barnes & Nobles with the cafes in them. And then one of them moved, they downsized, which I actually like it in there. It's nice and kind of cozy in there now, but no cafe. And it's in a different building, so you have to make a kind of a special trip to go there. But the one in the main mall is still in existence. I like Barnes & Noble, but at the same time, I really crave a little bookstore. I want a little bookstore that's cozy and just makes you feel like you're doing something special when you go in there. Barnes & Noble's a little overwhelming, I think, sometimes. It's nice, don't get me wrong. I love it, but I would love a little bookstore. So anyway, Wuthering Heights, if you're not familiar with it, I'll just give you a little overview. I want to just do the whole video today, but I'm not going to do that because there is so much in this book, you guys. There's so much. It is a book that you either love or hate. I don't think there's any middle ground with Wuthering Heights. If you don't know anything about it, it's filled with violence. It's very violent. It's very toxic relationship-ish. It's very, not even morally gray people. These are morally black people. They're just like a morally, not even that. It's a morally muddy abyss. That's what it is. And it is, it's just ugly. And in the midst of all this ugliness, there's a beauty. And if you can see the beauty and you can feel the beauty and you understand it, you will love Wuthering Heights. So my thought on the path I want to take on talking about Wuthering Heights is that it's a good book and that you should read it and that you should like it whether you want to or not, because that's how I feel about Wuthering Heights. So it's written by Emily Bronte. The Brontes, of course, 3 sisters who all wrote probably Wuthering Heights, and it was the only one by Emily. She also wrote a lot of poetry that's, if you ever get your hands on some Emily Bronte poetry, she's very good. I really like her poetry. But Charlotte was the older sister, and she wrote several books. I think she wrote more like 4 or 5. I could be wrong about that. And most famously, Jane Eyre, which I love to watch every single version of the movies of those. Whereas on the opposite hand, I do not want to read, I don't want to watch Wuthering Heights movies. I hate them. I've tried every one. I hate them all. Especially the most recent one I saw was just abysmal. And it just doesn't translate. It does not translate well to the screen at all. But also there is Anne Bronte, and she is one that we don't hear about very much. So unless you're a big Bronte fan and you've really tried to get into it, you might not even know that she wrote. Her famous book is The Tenant of Wildfell Hall, and it is really honestly one of the best ones of all the Brontes. I think it might be the most realistic and the most, even though Wuthering Heights, I'm sure, must have shocked many people at that time period. Anne's was daring, very daring. And I'm going to do a whole thing on that book, but get your hands on Tenant of Wildfell Hall. It's amazing. It's so good. Anyway, 3 sisters all wrote. They all put a little bit of their past in there because they had lost 2 older sisters. They lost their mother. They lived with their father, who was kind of a minister in the town of Haworth in Yorkshire. And Wuthering Heights takes place in Yorkshire, and she writes so well about nature. You can tell that Emily Bronte, she's known for walking the moors and just being very, very much a nature girl, and you can tell that in this book, which is probably one of the reasons I like it. But there are 2 main characters. One is Kathy. One is Heathcliff. Kathy is known as a spirited lass, but she really takes it to another level. She's got a mean streak. She's got a mean streak, a crazy streak. I don't know really what her problem was, but she's also respectable in some ways because she was always authentic. She was always herself. She didn't simper and try to please people. Even when she got married, she wasn't someone who just tried to please her husband. She was still herself for the most part. Heathcliff also. So very authentic, but in a bad way because he was so violent. Nothing is known about his early years. He was adopted, but not officially adopted by Kathy's father. Well, Kathy had an older brother, Hindley, and Hindley was kind of a shame to his dad. Their father didn't really like either of his children. Hindley, of course, was going to inherit Wuthering Heights, which was a very old house from the 1500s. And a fine place. It was a farm, but a nice place. And they were gentry, I guess. They were well off. But the house itself was dark. And then they meet the Lintons, and their house is, of course, light. And the Lintons are light and have light hair, whereas everyone in Wuthering Heights kind of has darker hair and darker eyes, and everything's dark. And so there's a contrast there. But some of the things I want to talk about in Wuthering Heights are going to be, is it or is it not a love story? Because I have seen people get so upset with like, this isn't a love story and this isn't love and this is so toxic. And yeah, it is very toxic. But I'm going to make the argument. I want to make the argument that there's definite love there. And you can agree or disagree, but I'm going to get into that part of it, I think, maybe more than anything. And so I'm excited to do that. It's going to be 1 or 2 videos that I do for Wuthering Heights. But also in that vein, I wish that Emily had been able to write more. I think Charlotte was more of the religious one. She was more of the morally upstanding one. She cared about her image more. She was embarrassed by Wuthering Heights, and I think she was embarrassed by the tenant of Wildfell Hall, because there's nothing to be embarrassed about with that book, but at the time, women didn't have rights and they didn't complain about it. And which is funny because she kind of writes about that stuff too, if you think about it, in Jane Eyre. But yeah, she didn't like Wuthering Heights or Tenant of Wildfell Hall as far as their popularity. I've always wondered about her. Like, was she jealous of her sisters? Because she was the one who took everything to be published. She came upon Emily's poems and wanted them published. Emily kept her things to herself. She wasn't really interested in that, or at least not that she had put out there into the world. And it was Charlotte who convinced her to publish. They all were very lonely, I think, living as they were kind of at the top of the hill with their parsonage. And I think the town was a very working man town, and they were kind of separate from a lot of that. But they wrote from a very young age. They would write stories and kind of compete to see who could write a good story. And I'm just kind of fascinated with the Brontes. They had really tragic lives when you think about it, how they lost their sisters and they lost their mom. I mean, some of them didn't even remember their mother. And their dad, I think, was not necessarily neglectful, but I think he was the kind of guy who just retreated into his room and didn't have too much to do with them and just left them to their own devices. And they had kind of a nursemaid type woman who looked after them. They were sent off to a boarding school that I assume was supposed to be good for them, but it became a big point in, well, Jane Eyre is mostly about that, or not mostly, but largely about getting sent to a school like that where they were under a lot of hypocrisy. And hypocrisy is something that you will see in all of their books, which I find really interesting. And I don't know if it's from those early experiences in the school they went to. I can't think. It's Lowood in Jane Eyre. It's called Lowood. But I can't think what the school was called that they went to in reality. But that's where their sisters contracted illness and ended up dying. So apparently it was just a huge thing to have illness and death, and the girls were hungry and made to feel like nothing's, basically abused. And here they were, mostly prominent people's daughters, people with money enough to send them, and thought that they were getting a education along with a religious education. They weren't rich by any means, but their father believed that they should have an education. He himself went to, I think he went to Cambridge, Oxford. Correct me, tell me. I can't remember. But he sent himself to college, basically. He made it happen. And he was just an Irish immigrant who wanted more for himself, and apparently was pretty smart to be able to get himself into college, through college, and into a good position. But they didn't have so much money that the girls wouldn't need to work if they weren't married. And I think they wanted to work, but they all became governesses. They all had some I don't know if Emily became a governess. Can't imagine her being a governess. But both Charlotte and Anne were governesses. So that you'll see those experiences in some of their books as well. Anyway, you'll just see a lot of that in their books. But what gets me, especially with Wuthering Heights, now there's a low level in Jane Eyre of roughness. There's a roughness to the people, I think. A lot of grabbing people and telling other people how to be. And here they're constantly grabbing people, restraining people, pushing people to the ground, hitting people, yelling, cursing, actual curses. There's just so much violence that I think that's why people hate it. It's definitely a toxic relationship, but at the same time, Kathy and Heathcliff start life together, basically. From the time she's 6, she has this friend, and they understand each other. And Heathcliff is abused by not her father, but her brother, her older brother. He's kind of the villain of the first half of the story. And then they're sort of verbally abused by this servant, Joseph, that they have, which, he's one of the most hated characters ever. And then there's a very interesting narration to this book also. So it is told in first person by a man who comes to rent a house from Heathcliff later in life. He's telling the story in first person, but most of the story is told by the servant who served Heathcliff's house, Kathy's house, and knows the story. But you're getting from her a very distorted view of things because she is has her opinions. She's not educated, and she made a lot of decisions for them that, they would say, go give this message, and she either would or wouldn't, depending on whether she thought she should. And that sometimes changed the way things happen. She started some trouble sometimes. Her intentions were always good, but her consequences of her actions are part of this book as well. So it's just a very interesting framework to write a book, and I think some people don't like it. They don't understand what's going on. Why are these people even in this? You can think that if you want. That's fine. I think it's actually pretty genius because there's no one to really cheer for in Wuthering Heights. It's all a little crazy. But even in the craziness, it's a good book. It's a great book, actually. And it's so deep. If you go really deep with it, which is what I've been working on, which is why I'm not ready to talk about the whole thing yet, because there's so much. When you really start thinking about it and you really start underlining passages and thinking about them, you think, you know what? I think that is love. I think that is love, because you have the Lintons who are so nice and easy and refined, and they're supposed to be the good ones. But are they? Are they the heroes? I don't know. There really aren't any heroes in Wuthering Heights. It's just a story. And it's a story about people who have a lot of pain, who have a lot of circumstances beyond their control, who are ultimately guided by the fact that you're raised a certain way, especially back then. A woman could only decide who she was going to marry if she wanted to change her circumstances. That was really the only way she could. So in that way, it's of value historically, I think, in that way. And Heathcliff was someone who was, they call him a gypsy. They call him very dark complexioned. So we don't really know what Heathcliff's origins were, but since she calls him a gypsy several times, I'll just take it that that is, his background and ancestry. But it shows a lot of prejudice. And I find that very interesting, and I think that's part of what makes Wuthering Heights important too, because abuse cycles. It just cycles in all people throughout history, and it's very important in this book to know that that's one of the reasons that everything goes to crap. Because honestly, if there wasn't that in there, you wouldn't have a story. You wouldn't have all this drama. You wouldn't have the toxicity. If people had treated Heathcliff right from the very beginning, you wouldn't have all the drama. You wouldn't. Things could have gone nicely for people. So that's just the icing on the cake, guys. There's so much to talk about in Wuthering Heights, and I plan to talk about more in my next video. So I hope you guys have a fantastic weekend. It is Friday, so enjoy it and enjoy the beginning of spring. We'll see ya. Thanks. Bye.